name is Rowena Zimmerman, and I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach for Blue Ridge PRISM. All of us at Blue Ridge PRISM are so happy to have you all here with us today. I'm joined by Rod Walker, who is the president of Blue Ridge PRISM. Tim Maywalt, who will be co-hosting with me and helping with the question and answers. Jim Hurley, who is here to answer all of your invasive species questions. So if you have questions about invasive species or invasive species management, go ahead and type that into the Q&A box, and Jim and Rod will try to help you with that. And of course, we're joined by our guest speaker, Doug Tallamy, and he will be speaking with us for around an hour. And then after that, we're going to have around a 30-minute question and answer period. If you have any audio issues, just take a look at this slide and make sure you joined with your computer audio on in Zoom and that your audio settings are set to the correct settings so you can hear us. I'll just leave that up for a little bit so you can read the different options to try. Just to let you know, closed captioning has been enabled. So hopefully at the bottom of your screen, you can see what I'm saying, and that will stay on for the majority of this meeting. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and everyone who registered or who is on the waiting list will receive in the next few days an email with the recording and additional information. So look for an email from us, and you'll be able to listen to the whole thing just in case you need to leave early or want to listen to it again to be inspired, as I'm sure many of us will. Some Zoom tips. When it is time for the Q&A, we ask that you not type your questions into the chat. That's just for us to say hi, for you to tell us where you're from. Please direct all of your questions to the Q&A tab on your screen, and all of us there will take a look and try to answer your questions and either type answers to them if they're invasive questions or direct them to Doug, time allowing. Once again, if you have any questions, please, you are welcome to contact us after this meeting at info@blueridgeprism.org. And also, if you want to hear more about Blue Ridge PRISM, we would love it if you would follow us on social media. We have a Facebook page, Instagram, and Twitter. And on the screen now is our Facebook address, which is basically facebook.com/Blue Ridge PRISM. We'd like to thank all of our supporters, especially the Virginia Environmental Endowment and donors like you. We can't thank you enough for those of you who are here today and also those of you who voluntarily donated for this program. Because of you, we're able to provide programs like this and ones in the future. If you would like, we would love for you to consider making a donation today or anytime in the future to Blue Ridge PRISM. And you can see the web address for that here, www.blueridgeprism.org/donate. Thank you so much for considering, and we really appreciate your support. So now I'm going to stop sharing and introduce the president of Blue Ridge PRISM, Rod Walker. He's here with us today and is just going to give us a short summary of what Blue Ridge PRISM does. Rod?
Okay, let me share my screen here, and we'll pull up just a couple of slides. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, so yeah, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our October quarterly meeting. This is just going to be a really short update on or introduction to the PRISM and our current activities before Rowena and I turn it over to Doug Tallamy. So this will be, as I say, really fast. So just the mission of the PRISM is to reduce the impact of invasive species in our targeted geography. We're now covering 12 counties. It counts over 3.5 million acres, including the Shenandoah National Park. We estimate there's 50,000 landowners in this space with 5 acres or more. You can see our 12 counties here, starting with Augusta and Nelson on the south, up the Blue Ridge, and to Clark and Loudoun on the north. So we used to be 10 counties, we're now 12. Here's the people that are involved with the PRISM, if you will. We have an advisory board made up of these stellar institutions here on the left. And we have lots of other partners, including the organizations listed here on the right. If you have an organization that would like to be involved with the PRISM, let us know. In terms of what do, we have 2 main activities. One is to educate, inspire, and help landowners throughout our 12 counties. We help them understand what it takes to remove and replace invasive plants. At the same time, we're involved in statewide actions to try and help with this invasive plant problem across the entire state. So really quickly, landowner activities include things like quarterly meetings. This is one of them. We do tabling events. I was slowly starting up again to be in person. We do speaking engagements. So again, if you've got a group and you'd like a PRISM person to come speak, we do that. We have workshops for ID and how to control and the tool demonstrations. We just did a whole series of those last week. So, just check the website to see how that works. We've got all kinds of materials with newsletters and things on our fact sheets on our website. If you've got questions, you've got a plant, you don't know what it is, take a couple of really good photos and send them on to info@blueridgeprism.org. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of our new landowner services in just a second. In the 8 years we've been around, we now have 3,800 people on our email list. We should be over 4,000 by the end of the year. So that's growing steadily. In terms of statewide activities, at our instigation, VDOT kicked off a study in January of last year. It's a 2-year study where they've hired Virginia Tech to sample hundreds of roadside locations throughout the state and catalog both the native and the non-native plants that are there, with a view of making recommendations to VDOT on changing their planting list to include mostly, if not entirely, native plants. We're also active with the Virginia noxious weeds list. There are a variety of plants currently on the list. There's 12 more in the process. It takes a couple of years to get them through the formal process, but you can see some of them listed here. We also have a drone project underway with University of Virginia. The notion is to be able to fly a drone with hyperspectral imagery across a piece of property and produce a map of specific species on that property. So that's moving along and progressing fairly well. We're involved in urging action on the spotted lanternfly, particularly the removal of Alanthus. And if any of you want to form another PRISM, we are happy to come help you do that. So just a couple of big changes in 2022. We've been fortunate. We've been able to add 2 more counties, Loudoun and Fauquier, to our service area. And really excited to say that we've added 2 full-time invasive management specialists, both to expand our partner relationships and also provide on-the-ground support for landowners in the 12 county area. So we've got 1 person working in our northern counties and 1 in the southern counties. So stay tuned for more information on how this program is going to work, but it's on the way. Fundraising, just to reiterate that we are a volunteer driven, if you will, and we don't rely on government funding for our operations. It's basically private donations and grants, including 2 grants that require us to raise matching funds to the tune of $40,000. And one of those is about to kick off right now. So stay tuned. You may see a solicitation in Q4 for our fundraising campaign. We really appreciate it if you help us out so we can continue to make the great progress that we are making. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Rowena. And if you have any other questions about the PRISM itself, please just send them off to info@blueridgeprism.org. Thank you very much. And we're all looking forward to hearing from Doug. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. So now it's my pleasure to just read a short introduction biography for Doug Tallamy. Doug Tallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 106 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 41 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His book, Bringing Nature Home, was published in 2007. The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Darke, was published in 2004. Nature's Best Hope, a New York Times bestseller, was released in February 2020. And his latest book, The Nature of Oaks, was released in March 2021. Doug is also renowned for his Homegrown National Park project and is an advocate for native plant gardening. With his work, he has changed the conversation about gardening in America. Thanks for joining us, Doug.
Well, thank you. Yeah, let's get started. Homegrown National Park, it's really our idea to enlist a vast army of landowners or volunteers to help us deal with the two big issues that we have today, biodiversity loss and invasive plants. They are related. But before we do that, let's talk about this creature. It looks like a fecal sac that a bird has dropped. It's actually a bola spider. Curious little thing, sits up on the leaves during the day, but at night it hangs from one of the leaves and suspends a single strand of silk, one sticky glob of glue at the end there. And sometimes they get carried away and they make a whole trap line of those. Here's the spider here monitoring that trap line. Typically it's just one though, and often a moth flies in and gets stuck on that sticky glob of glue, and the spider will wrap it up in short order and then have a nice meal. And she'll do that repeatedly, as many times as she can. And after she gets enough energy, she creates an egg mass. It's an ornate structure that then hangs from that place all winter long. Sometimes she can do 2 or 3 if she's had enough to eat. And you might wonder how that moth accidentally flies into that little sticky glob of glue. It's not an accident at all. She's actually releasing a sex pheromone for a particular species of moth. And in my yard, that moth is the bronze cutworm. And I know that because I unwound a lot of her little prey items and saw what she had been sucking on. That's what the bronze cutworm caterpillar looks like. And I have bronze cutworms because I have goldenrod, which is the primary plant they like to eat. This is the dot line white. It's a very beautiful and curious looking moth. I have them as well because I have their host plant oaks. This is a white oak in my front yard. And I have the moth because I did not rake the oak leaves away from underneath the tree. And that's because right there is the cocoon of that moth that's going to spend the winter. Little close up. And of course, if we rake our leaves away, we raked away the cocoon and all the other things that are important in that leaf litter. I have evening primrose moths at our house because we have evening primrose. And the moth comes and spends the day with its head stuffed in the flowers. It's very cute. Sometimes it's crowded, but they're still very cute. I have zebra swallowtails because we've got pawpaws. These are all specialized relationships. It would take me a week or more to describe all of the species that now call my property home. It would not take me a week to talk about all the species that are calling this property home. And this is a typical landscape. There is no goldenrod there, so there's no bronze cutworm, so there's no bola spider. There are no oaks, so there's no dot line whites. There's no evening primrose, so there's no evening primrose moth, no pawpaws, no zebra swallowtails, and so on. There's very little that can live in a typical landscape across the US. And we've got 135 million acres of typical residential landscapes across the US. And that's one of the reasons that we're seeing headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. Those two, of course, are related because the birds eat the insects. 2/3 of Earth's wildlife are gone. The UN says we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. And they said that 2 years ago. So now I guess it's the next 18 years. 40% of the Earth's plants face extinction. None of this is good news. And that's why Elizabeth Colbert gets to write the book about the 6th great extinction event that the Earth is experiencing right now. It's had 5 big ones in the past, and we're now in the 6th one, but it's the first one to be caused by a living organism, and that is us. Jason Hickel says biodiversity loss is such a strange euphemism for mass destruction of non-human beings. Yeah, genocide of the living world. Martin Tai says that humans have proven they're incapable of taking over planetary management from nature. Nature believes in balance. Humans believe in endless growth. Only one is right. I totally agree. So this is a map showing the areas with the greatest number of threatened species, and those areas reflect perfectly the areas that have the greatest number of species, period, because wherever there are species, most of them are threatened. You can look around this map and decide where you live, but pretty much everywhere we're doing in biodiversity. So people are hearing about this, and we do have reactions to it, so much so that people are actually writing about that. Richard Hobbs has written about our response to biodiversity loss, and he says, it's very similar to the 5 stages of grief that people experience when they hear they have a terminal disease. First, there's denial, and we certainly have a lot of people denying that we have an issue. There's anger, a lot of people angry about it, including me. Bargaining, you know, maybe it's not going to be so bad. Maybe we can fix things enough. Depression, yeah, we're all bordering on the edge of depression. Then finally, acceptance. Well, I'm gonna push back on that last one. Acceptance is equivalent to giving up and accepting, okay, this is terrible and we're just going to have to deal with it. Acceptance is not an option. Giving up is not an option because nature is not optional. We depend on it. It's what keeps us alive on planet Earth. So we need a 6th option here, and that is action. You know, our national parks were established primarily because they were beautiful places. They just had exquisite scenery, and people appreciated that. Teddy Roosevelt said it very clearly. The establishment of the National Park Service is justified by considerations of good administration, giving himself a little pat on the back there. The value of natural beauty as a natural asset, and the effectiveness of outdoor life and recreation in the production of good citizenship. In other words, our parks were established because they were pretty places for us to play in. And that's an okay justification, but it means that we focused on the prettiest places only. And that means there's only 12% of the US that is federally protected at this point, which means what 88% is not. What's happened in that 88% outside of our parks and preserves is appalling. I mean, you've heard these statistics. Every 30 seconds, a football field worth of America's natural areas is disappearing to development, the most oxymoronic word in ecology. 44 million acres of lawn, an area the size of New England. We've paved over an area larger than Ohio, and that statistic is 20 years old. There are 2 million acres of golf courses, which is an area larger than Rhode Island and Delaware combined. You know, pages and pages of statistics like this. I like this analogy. Matt Lee Ashley says that evaluating the condition of nature is a bit like watching a leaky pipe. If a person focuses on each drop as it falls to the floor, it doesn't seem so bad. But if they leave for a day, when they come back, their room is full of water. That's exactly what we've done. We take little bits of nature here, there, everywhere. When you add it all up, it becomes devastating. So let's address some of the questions that people have. Why aren't the parks and preserves that we have enough to sustain biodiversity? The answer is very simple. They're too small. They're too small and too isolated from each other. When you take a large area like that and you shrink it down to an area like this, and that's an exaggeration, you're taking large populations and shrinking them down to small or tiny populations. And that's the problem, because all populations fluctuate. In good times, they go up. In bad times, they go down. If you're a large population like this top line here, even in your down cycle, there's enough individuals so you can increase quickly when times get better. But if you're a tiny population in a little isolated park or preserve, those normal fluctuations often lead to blinking out entirely. Your population fluctuates and then boom, it's gone. And unless you can recolonize that site, it's gone permanently. And this is even more devastating in today's world with the drastic weather that we're having. And you get one hurricane, you get one derecho or one flood, and the little isolated parks and preserves are wiped clean, and then that's it. So there's research all over the world that is showing that our natural areas are not large enough to sustain the nature that sustains us. This is the part we need to be focused on. But I mean, this is the hardest part for me to convince people, is that nature is not optional. We totally depend on it. We've got to take care of it. Now, we tend to use extinction as a measure of trouble. When something goes extinct, we're going to act. But that's like going to the doctors after you're dead. We need to act a lot earlier than that. And there are people, Dave Wagner is one of them, who says, yeah, we've got an extinction crisis, but what we really have to beware of is the loss of common species, and not just the loss, but the reduction of the abundance of common species, because it's the common species that are running our ecosystems. So this, of course, is the American chestnut, dominated the Appalachian Mountains from actually Nova Scotia all the way down to Georgia. Billions of trees lost to the chestnut blight. And I know they're not extinct, but they're functionally extinct. They are no longer performing their vital roles in our forested ecosystems. The rusty patch bumblebee, we hear a lot about that these days. People don't realize that it was just a few years ago. It was one of the most common bees in our meadows. And now if you see it, you got to report it, because it's so rare, definitely headed for an extinction event. Even the beaver. Now the beaver's coming back, but it's nothing compared to what it was when European settlers first came here. They dominated every waterway, every watercourse in the country, and controlled the hydrology of North America. We eliminated them and totally changed the hydrology of North America. So the impact of the loss of these common species is huge, but sometimes it's hard to notice. We're really not talking about extinction. We're talking about defaunation, removing the abundance of important species. It's local, it's everywhere, and we don't notice it. We tend not to notice it because of what we call shifting baseline. We tend to think that the way things ought to be is the way they were when we were kids. That's what we grew up with. So that's the way they ought to be. And of course, if you grew up in an area that's already depauperate, already been species have already been removed, then you think that's normal. None of us are missing the passenger pigeon, because none of us were alive when it was around doing this. I mean, quite a spectacle. So shifting baseline means that we're losing biodiversity, the biodiversity that sustains us, and we're not even noticing it. And by we, I'm talking about the general public, the group of people that can actually make a difference. So what should we do? Well, we got the UN, they're making resolutions all the time. They sit there, they argue. They're negotiating to protect biodiversity, but these negotiations are moving at a snail's pace. So, can you believe it? We are negotiating whether or not we're going to preserve life on planet Earth. So I'm not going to rely on the UN here. I'm going to go to E.O. Wilson. Edward O. Wilson, of course, at Harvard, he died this year, the day after Christmas. Terrible loss to the world of conservation. He's been concerned about the loss of biodiversity his entire career. And in 2016, he wrote Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life. And he made the very bold statement and supported it with a book's worth of science. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we have to save functioning ecosystems. We have to save nature on at least half of planet Earth. That is his Half Earth concept. And that actually has given way to some global initiatives, the 30 by 30 initiative, which is step one towards the 50 by 50. We're going to save 30% of the planet by 2030 and 50% by 2050. It's exactly what EO wants us to do. Well, that's great. But how are we going to do that? How are we going to do that? Almost half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. So that's not going to be the first place we're going to be saving biodiversity. Then we've got just about 8 billion people in the other half, including all of our roads and our detritus and everything that we humans do to the environment. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So how can we actually do this? Well, this is what I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I actually believe we can realize E.O. Wilson's dream, but we need a new approach to conservation in order to do it. In the past, our approach to conservation was one that had humans here and nature someplace else. We seem to embrace this idea that humans and nature cannot coexist. We cannot live together in the same place at the same time. Well, that brings us back to that third half of the earth that we don't have. Our only option, I'm going to argue, is living with nature. It is an option, and I think it's the only viable option that's left to us. And it's the one we haven't explored yet. In the past, of course, conservationists worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people. And that'll be easy because there's a lot of people just about everywhere. So here's the challenge. We've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. That is our only option. So if protected areas are not large enough, we now need to practice conservation outside of those protected areas. Instead of just practicing here, we got to practice it here. It's not where people have typically gone to practice conservation, but it's where we need to start doing it in earnest. Mary Reynolds, she's got a big voice in Europe. She says, we've got to change from gardeners to guardians. It gives gardeners a new, very important role, but that requires a new mindset. Now we're really talking about ecological fragmentation of viable habitats. We've left little viable habitats here and there. They're getting smaller all the time. So people have proposed biological corridors as the solution. We're going to connect them, excuse me, remnant cold, with biological corridors so that plants and animals can move back and forth between those viable habitats. I'm going to argue that's not enough. Because those viable habitats are still small, and the natural oscillations in populations will still lead to local extinctions. So what we need to do is create viable habitats in between the viable habitats, which will really connect them. So, that's good. This is better. The areas that are not green here, those will be our cities and much of our agriculture, but we can green an awful lot of places that currently are not considered viable habitats. That's the goal. To achieve that, though, we need to change our view of property rights, what we have the right to do on our property. We've had this idea that if you own a piece of property, you have the right to do whatever you want with it. Those are very powerful views in this country. So I'm going to argue, though, that it's not going to work because our yards are not like Las Vegas. You all know that what happens in Las Vegas stays in Vegas. Maybe some of you really know that. But that's not what's happening in our yards. What happens on our property does not stay on our property, and that's the problem. Our property is part of a local ecosystem, and whatever we do on our property is going to impact that entire ecosystem and thus impact everything and everybody around it. The amount of lawn you have will determine whether rain is infiltrating, whether it's leaving as stormwater runoff, whether it's carrying nitrogen and phosphorus and herbicides and pesticides, all the things that we put on our lawn. And all of those are going to affect our local watershed. How we landscape its home is going to determine whether we're supporting pollinators or whether we're eliminating the resources that they need. How we landscape is going to determine how much carbon that our property pulls from the atmosphere and then stores both in its plants and also in the soil. Remember, our plants are pumping carbon into the soil every day through their root system for long-term storage. Once it's in the soil, unless the soil is disturbed again, it can stay there thousands of years. And that's why our soils are brown or black, from the carbon that plant roots have put there. Extremely important ecosystem service. Our plant choices are going to determine whether we're harboring the ecological tumors that we all know and love, like calorie pear, these ornamentals that then escape and become our, the most serious invasive species that we have in North America. Or whether we're using plants that support the insects, that support the birds, and so many other parts of our food webs. How we landscape is going to determine how much life Earth can sustain. It's that simple. And that's something that the average homeowner is not thinking about. It turns out to be an awesome responsibility. but it also creates a grassroots solution to the biodiversity crisis, which is, the invasive species crisis is totally linked to that. Grassroots, we've got millions of people out there who can help us get these things under control. We're talking about private property. 78% of the country is privately owned by over 100 million people. 85.6% of the East Mississippi, here east of the Mississippi, is privately owned. We got a lot of people out there that can help us with these problems. So collectively, I'm saying property owners and volunteers that help property owners are now the hope and future of conservation. It goes way beyond the trained professionals that we've been relying on in the past. So let's talk about lawn. It's the low-hanging fruit. It's what got me thinking about this a long time ago. Way back in 2005, Melissa et al. Came out with a statistic that there were 40 million acres of lawn in the US. It's now up to 44 million acres. That's an area bigger than New England. So we need lawn because it's a status symbol, and we need lawn to display our Halloween decorations. I get that part. But in 2007, I had an idea. What if we cut that area of lawn in half? Just somebody's crying over here. We can create a Homegrown National Park. This is the idea I had, which, because we're talking about 20 million acres, it could be put towards conservation right at home. And if you add up 20 million acres, it turns out to be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, plus Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Homegrown National Park would be the biggest park in the country. So I had this idea, and I started putting it in my talks and talking about it everywhere I went. Then when I wrote Nature's Best Hope, I made a chapter called Homegrown National Park. But so far, all I really did was talk about it. And then I met Michelle Alfandari. She was a semi-retired businesswoman from Manhattan. She was not part of the choir, didn't know anything about the biodiversity crisis, didn't understand about conservation, but she did know how to run a nonprofit. And she came up to me after a talk that her neighbor dragged her to, by the way. And she said, you've got to talk to the non-choir. You got to get to the people who don't already believe all this stuff, or you're not going to succeed. And I said, I know that, but it's only the choir who invites me to give talks. And she said, well, long story short, she said, we need to create a nonprofit. We'll call it Homegrown National Park. And the goal will be to get this message out to the people who don't already know it, the millions and millions and millions of property owners out there who are the future of conservation. So we created this we call it the map, the concept of the map. Homegrown National Park is free, by the way, and you register your property, you register the area that you're going to be a good steward of, and that area of your county will light up. And we're working with a tech company now to get all these lit up areas to coalesce, so you get to see conservation efforts across the country light up, and we'll have a visual record of our success as we move towards this initial step one of 30-30. We're preserving 30% of the country by 2030. That's the idea. We've been in existence for 2 years. We've got over 20,000 people signed up. It really is, it's a science-based grassroots call to action. How do we get all the people out there on board with the conservation that needs to be done so that we can address climate change, biodiversity crisis, invasive species, all these things at once? We are asking people to, yes, reduce the area of lawn, plant more natives, remove the invasives that almost everybody has in their property, either the edges or as ornamentals right in their yard, protect any natural areas that they may own. Homegrown National Park's product, it's national awareness, not just of the problem, but also of the solution, and also of the individual's role in that solution. We want to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional and that everybody owns a responsibility to sustaining it because everybody needs it. It's not just the job of a few conservation biologists and a few ecologists. It's everybody's job. And it will provide measurable progress toward that 30-30 initiative that the UN is talking about. The benefits will be converting hope into action. We're hopeful, but boy, we've got to do something or it's not going to mean anything. It does not rely on any governmental support. We'll be happy to have governmental support, but we don't need it. We're going to rely on grassroots support, and it merges national conservation efforts that already exist. Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, Wild Ones, all those organizations that have paid membership. We're not competing with them because we don't have paid membership. We're just going to bring people in, tell them what the problem is, and then push them out to these organizations so they can get more support. And it will create one aspirational visual. We can see how when you put all these efforts together on a single map, maybe we're not so bad off. And that map will reveal holes in biological corridors that we are trying to build those to connect those wild places. There's urgency in enacting Homegrown National Park. You know, with most nonprofits, you can do a slow build over a number of years. We got 135 million acres of residential landscape in this country. And if we added 1,000 acres to Homegrown National Park each month, it would take us 11,250 years to meet our ultimate goal. That's too long. Slow build's not gonna do it. Excuse me. So who are we talking about here? Who's going to help build Homegrown National Park? Certainly residential property owners, corporate property owners, ecological landscapers, woodlot owners, farmers, land managers, land conservancies. I didn't put down volunteers. I've got to. 82% of the country lives in cities, and many people don't own land per se, but they all can help volunteer, help people who do. So what we need to do is expand our ecological IQ in this country. We have to get people to recognize what every landscape needs to do. Every landscape has 4 ecological responsibilities, and this has to become common knowledge. They all have to support food webs. They all have to sequester carbon. They all have to manage the watershed in which they lie, and they all have to support pollinators. Everybody's got to recognize that lawn is the worst choice of plant in terms of accomplishing those goals. It doesn't accomplish any of them. It wrecks the watershed. It doesn't support any pollinators. It doesn't support food webs. And it's the worst plant choice in terms of sequestering carbon. We've all got to learn that plant choice matters. You know, what's the figure? 86% of our woody invasive plants are from ornamentals that we buy at the nurseries. They're pretty, but just not necessary. Plant choice matters. There are 3 kinds of plants out there. There are plants that contribute energy to local food webs, and I'm going to use oaks as the best example because they're contributing more energy to local food webs than any of our other plants. Ginkgos would be a good example of a non-contributor plant that is existing, but it's not contributing energy because nothing eats it. So it's not adding to the food web. Now, it's not an invasive species. It just kind of sits there. And of course, a wonderful example of a detractor would be a Callery pear, Bradford pear. They are escaping. They're contributing very little energy and replacing the plants that do. So which plants we choose is going to determine how many contributors, non-contributors, or detractors we have in our landscapes. We also need a new appreciation of how important caterpillars are. I talk about caterpillars all the time because they are important. They are contributing more energy to food webs than any other plant eater. So if we develop landscapes that do not have enough caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs. And that, of course, is not an option. And we have to understand what the concept of the keystone species is, keystone plants. I call certain plants keystone plants because they are supporting more caterpillars, adding more energy to food webs than any other type of plant. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the arch and the Roman arch. If you take the keystone out of the Roman arch, the arch falls down. Well, if you take keystone plants out of our local food webs, the food web collapses because they are making the most caterpillars. They are supplying the most energy to our local food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold up that house. They're the support system. You cannot build a house out of wallpaper. And that's what we've been trying to do for the last 100 years. You're not through building your ecological house when you have your keystone plants, but it's an essential first step. And we also have to acknowledge that insects are the little things that run the world. E.O. Wilson told this way back in 1987, and he wasn't kidding. A world without insects is a world without humans. And we have to accept that 90% of those insects can only exist if they have the plants that they have co-evolved with. 90% of our insect herbivores are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. And the monarch butterfly is a perfect example. If you take out the milkweeds from your yard and replace it with hostas, the monarch's not going to start to develop on hostas. It's locked into eating milkweeds, and it will have two choices: fly away and find milkweed someplace else, or starve to death. And the monarch it's just one of most of the insects that are out there. We've got to put the plants that run the food webs back, or it's not going to work. And we have to recognize the fact that pollinators are necessary everywhere, not just in agriculture. I don't like the way we have promoted saving our pollinators, saying we need them because they pollinate a third of our crops. It's actually about a 1/12 of our crops, according to May Berenbaum. But I hear people say, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because they're pollinating 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants. If we lost our pollinators, we'd lose 80 to 90% of the plants on the planet, and that is not an option. We've got to convince homeowners that our native ground nesting bees, which is 70% of our 4,000 species of native bees, they're totally harmless. They are not going to sting you. What's going to sting you in your yard is either a honeybee or a yellow jacket or bald-faced hornet that are not bees at all. So welcoming bees into your landscape is a wonderful thing, and it's not dangerous. We have to start to appreciate the value of the leaves that fall from our trees. That's the ground cover, the blanket that protects our soil community, all of the detritivores that turn the nutrients in these leaves over, returning them to our plants, and that protect our mycorrhizal associations, allowing the nutrients to get to our trees. It's a vital part of our soil ecosystem, and we don't treat it that way. We rake it up and throw it away as if it's garbage. And we also, people say, well, I got to get rid of the leaves because our plants can't grow through them. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. This is golden seal. Look, it's growing right through leaf litter. Virginia creeper, really good ground cover over leaf litter. Wood poppies at my house. There are all kinds of examples of plants that are going to go well right through your leaf litter without any raking at all. We're starting to understand, but we got to really spread this knowledge, that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect decline. If we do all the things that I'm talking about, we bring insects to our yard, but then kill them with our security lights, that's not a good thing either. And we have to understand that mosquito fogging certainly kills insects. Mosquito foggers will tell you it's a natural product, so it's okay. No, it is a natural product, but that doesn't make it okay. Cyanide's a natural product too, and it's not okay. And also, they say it only kills mosquitoes. That's not even close to true. It kills all the insects it comes in contact with. And look at that picture. It comes in contact with all of them, including our pollinators. By the way, we can reduce the impacts of our night lighting by favoring yellow wavelengths over white or blue wavelengths. If you put in one of those yellow bulbs you get at the hardware store, overnight, you could save millions of insects. They are not attracted to yellow wavelengths. And if you use a yellow LED, you can save millions of dollars too. Excuse me. We have to appreciate the fact that conservation is appropriate at any level, any size property. This is Pam Carlson's property in Chicago. It's 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size, or a simple container of native plants can be extremely valuable for people who don't own a lot of property. Most of all, we've got to start to trust that conservation really works. We can put it back together again if we start now. So here are just a few examples. We talked about the fact that we've lost 3 billion fewer. We've got 3 billion fewer breeding birds in North America than we had just 50 years ago. But waterfowl during that same period has increased 54%. Why? Because we focused on its conservation. Ducks Unlimited and other groups have helped to bring back many of our wetlands, and the birds responded right away. This is all very positive. This is the Natusa grasslands, 3,800 acres in Illinois. It's got 730 native plant species, 180 species of birds. It was a cornfield not long ago. We can bring it back. Private citizens can play important roles too. The bluebird, you all know the story of the bluebird. They nested in isolated snags, like this little hole up here. So we not only did we get rid of our snags, but we introduced things like the starling and the house sparrow that competed for use of any natural holes that were out there. And the bluebird was well on its way to disappearing in the East not that long ago. But then citizens got involved. We learned that bluebird boxes are very effective. People put them up all over. And now the bluebird is one of the most common birds that we have in our neighborhoods. I'm going to talk a little bit about the conservation we've done on our property right here, because it's one of the things that has motivated me to talk as much as I do. It really works. Cindy and I moved into a farm that was broken up into 10-acre lots back in the year 2000. It had been mowed for hay before we built our house, and then taken out of mowing for 3 years before we moved in, which means it was covered with invasive species. When you mow for hay in the East, of course, you're mowing the rootstocks of all the invasive woodies that have escaped into these properties. So most of the property looked like this: Japanese honeysuckle, multiflora rose, oriental bittersweet, autumn olive, bush honeysuckle. That is Cindy getting rid of this stuff. It's, the invasive species problem seems overwhelming because it's very close to overwhelming, but it didn't overwhelm Cindy, who essentially got rid of it from our 10 acres with a lot of work. But I'm just emphasizing this because we do need to get rid of, we need to control them. And yes, we have to constantly do it because they keep invading from our neighbors' yards. But it is possible. It's possible. Don't give up. This is what the front looks like now. We put an awful lot of plants back, and I've been counting the number of moth species, those caterpillars that are driving our local food web for the last 5 years, taking pictures of them. On up to 1,195 species of moths that now make a living on that place that was a jangle of non-native plants that didn't support almost any of those moth species. Things like the chinkapin leaf miner, the skullcap skeletonizer, the neighbor, the little devil, the horrid zalie, the obtuse yellow, the explicit arches, and yes, we had the implicit arches too, the great flamigid, the pink-shaded fern moth, the scribbler, the lemon plagotis, the showy emerald, the green marble, the Harris's three-spot, the bride, the eyed pectes, on poison ivy, by the way, tufted bird-dropping moth. Who wouldn't want the tufted bird-dropping moth? You just have fun saying the name. And, more than 1,000 more. What's going to keep all these moth species in check? Well, it's going to be all the birds that have come to our property to breed. We've got 60 species of birds that we've recorded breeding on our property, not flying by, but breeding. And they're doing it because we put the plants back. We got rid of the invasives, put the plants back, invited the moths to come make a living by putting the right plants back. And then you've got all the bird food. So of course the birds come. Conservation at work. We also have a lot of invertebrate predators that keep these things under control, like ambush bugs and assassin bugs and predatory stink bugs. We've got hymenopteran parasitoids. We've got predatory wasps. We've got vertebrates too. We've got the skunks and the possums and the raccoons, all of which eat a lot of insects. We've got foxes. 25% of a fox's diet is insects. And we've got toads, and we've got salamanders, and we've got ringneck snakes, and we've got the cutest little gray tree frogs that are actually green when they're little, all of which are eating the insects in our yard and keeping them under control. All right, so I started Homegrown National Park thinking about reducing lawn, but it didn't take me long to realize that's not going to be enough. Saving 20 million acres sounds great, but we got a lot more than that to save. Our lawn goals are too modest. So let's talk about other types of privately owned ecosystems like woodlots and croplands and rangeland. There are 406 million acres of woodlots managed by private citizens, not logging companies in the US. We've got to include these in Homegrown National Park. In Pennsylvania alone, 738 private forest landowners, and they're controlling 11.5 million acres of forest. And I'm sure the statistics in Virginia are very close to that. So how these forests, these forest woodlots are managed is going to make a huge difference. We have to log them in a sustainable way if we're going to log them at all. And we have to manage the invasive species load that are almost always in these properties. So there are foundations for sustainable forestry around. This is one from Western Pennsylvania, run by Troy Firth. This says that, you can do high grade harvesting or you can do worst first forest management, and it makes a difference. When you do high grade harvesting, in other words, you take the best trees out and leave the rest, you get a good harvest once. And in terms of invasive species, that creates a great deal of disturbance. It's very close to clear cutting. And that's what invasive species love. They love disturbance. Anytime you do that, they are there first. And then you've got a huge problem. Worst first selection, where you're taking smaller but more frequent harvests, leads to higher yields over time indefinitely, and you don't have the huge scars on the landscape that invite invasive species. But in almost all these woodlots, we've got invasive plant problems, so we've got to manage them as well. And if we're going to manage them, we have to manage the deer at the same time. Overpopulation of deer and invasive plants are intricately linked. We think that our native plants are poor competitors compared to these thugs we brought in from Asia and other places. That's turning out to be really not so. The problem is that our deer, overpopulation of deer, up to 14 times over the carrying capacity of what they should be, they're eating all the natives and leaving the non-natives. So of course the non-natives have a competitive advantage. Every little oak tree or ash or whatever that pops its head above the soil there is eaten by a deer. The autumn olive isn't touched, the barberry isn't touched, the burning bush isn't touched. So of course, that's what you end up with. Managing deer is essential from that perspective and many others. All these exclusion experiments show the difference between having deer and not having deer in terms of forest health. We've got huge problems from stiltgrass, Asian jumping worms, and new research, particularly by Bern Blasi at Cornell, is showing that there's actually a link. It's not sure how it works, but stiltgrass and Asian jumping worms are encouraged by the presence of deer and discouraged when you get rid of them. Another good reason to control our deer. How about cropland? Can't ignore that. We've got 410 million acres of cropland in the US, the light green areas spread around. And there are 4 ways we can increase biodiversity without impacting yield on these crop acres. We can manage the roadsides. Right now, the roadside new ethic is to get rid of all the quote weeds, which are the native plants, the asters and the milkweeds and the evening primrose, all the things that support our monarchs and our bees and other insects, and replace it with lawn that has to be mowed and managed. We've gotten rid of our hedgerows. We want to start including prairie strips for pollinators, and we've got to reduce the use of neonicotinoid insecticides. The monarch has disappeared, is now listed by the IUCN as an endangered species because of that. We've done it over literally millions of roadside miles, particularly in the ag belt of the Midwest, and gotten rid of the resources that they need. So instead of this land ethic, how about this? People are starting to do this. I heard the other day they've done up to 1,000 miles of roadway in Iowa alone, starting to put it back. Great idea, great idea. Return those hedgerows as much as possible, and we have to manage them. So many hedgerows that we have left are just nothing but autumn olive and bush honeysuckle. That's not going to solve the problem. They've got to be managed as multi-species native hedgerows. And here are just a little bit of data to encourage you to do that. We compared caterpillars, those all-important things driving that food web, in hedgerows that were invaded, this one largely by multiflora rose and autumn olive, with hedgerows that are not invaded. And found a 68% reduction in the number of species of caterpillars in the invaded hedgerows, a 91% reduction in the abundance of those caterpillars, and a 96% reduction in the biomass of those caterpillars and the energy in that ecosystem. In other words, the amount of bird food, you take a 96% away when you allow your hedgerows to become invaded. So we want hedgerows, they're great habitat when we keep them native. Prairie strips. Great way to add pollinator habitat to our corn and our soybeans, which are otherwise ecological dead spaces. But they do more than pollinators, support pollinators. They reduce topsoil loss by 95%. You put them perpendicular to the flow of water on this landscape. Excuse me. They reduce water pollution by 90% because they're intercepting any extra fertilizer that we put on the property. And even though the grower is sacrificing a little bit of land, they get cost share support from USDA CREP programs. So it's gaining in popularity. If you are a farmer, please consider adopting this. My grandkids visited me a couple of days ago and gave me a nice cold. So we're dealing with that. Neonicotinoid seed coatings. Neonicotinoids are 7,000 times more toxic to insects than DDT was. When you buy seeds, that's what they look like. They're all coated with neonics. Excuse me. The big problem is they're used preventively. It's on the seed, whether you've got an insect problem or not. And if you compare fields, whether you have the coated seeds versus the ones you don't have coated seeds, there's no difference in yield. So there's no reason to do it. Only 5% of this product is taken up by the plant. 95% washes off into the watershed or blows away as dust. And it's killing insects everywhere. Rangeland. Most of the land's in rangeland, 770 million acres of rangeland, 4.5 times the size of Texas. This could be managed really well and all become part of Homegrown National Park. Cindy and I went to an experimental range in Nebraska. This is what it looked like. Those are not bison, those are cows, but it was not overgrazed. The cows are kept out of any waterway. And those are the two things that will bring back the vitality of our rangeland. These are sunflowers here. The birds were everywhere there. So the cows were happy, the birds were happy, biodiversity was happy. All of our rangelands, our prairies, our eastern meadows were grazed at some point. Those plants evolved with grazers. So grazing is natural. If we keep the cows out of the streams, the willows and the cottonwoods come back and the diversity explodes. All right. There's something that's common to each one of these conservation approaches. And that is that whether or not they succeed depends on decisions that you and I make, that everybody makes every day. I had a student in a course last year, and she had one of the essays that she wrote had this statement, and I just loved it. She says, you know, conservationists claim to be managing species and habitats, but what we're actually managing is people. And that is so true. These are people problems. These are sociological problems. We know what the biological solutions are. It's getting people to do it. That is the issue. So that's why I talk about changing the culture. It's one of the goals of Homegrown National Park. We want people to recognize that nature is not our enemy. Nature is our nurturing mother. We don't want this adversarial approach to nature. We want a collaborative one. Can we do this? I think we can. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And you can do that by joining Homegrown National Park. And if you do, it empowers you. You know, people are recognized the earth has got some serious problems these days, and a lot of people feel absolutely powerless. But this will empower you. What can one person do? One person can shrink the lawn. One person can modify your lights. One person can add a pollinator garden. One person can remove those invasive plants from all of your private property. And if everybody did it, that you were 78% done then, 85% done in the east. We can add the powerful plants that are driving our food webs. We can fire Mosquito Joe. These are things that one person can do and totally revitalize the ecosystem where their property exists and enhance their local ecosystem instead of detract it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You'll get depressed. Just worry about the piece of the earth that you can manage. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. We hope that Homegrown National Park will provide the motivation and the guidance for millions to tackle these really important conservation challenges. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Doug. It was such a pleasure to hear all of that and to learn more about the Homegrown National Park project. We've got some time now for questions. And I just wanted to start off with one that we got from someone who registered and sent a question in when they registered. Is there a story you can tell about either when you began this path or discovered yourself on this path?
I can always tell stories.
We'd love to hear them.
Yeah, I actually get this question quite a bit. What brought me here? I was born loving nature. So that's where the story started. Take no credit at all. You know, I just was born loving it. I didn't know anything about insects. I like snakes and turtles. I watched a bulldozer bury my favorite turtle pond right next door, which convinced me that we needed conservation. I was in third grade when that happened, but I made the same mistake that everybody else made, and that was we have to conserve the places that are not already just wrecked. And yeah, that's great. We've got to do that. But it never once occurred to me that I could have redug that pond right on my property, right in my backyard. My parents wouldn't have minded. I could have moved that entire ecosystem over and restored it. Never thought of it. Instead, I mowed the lawn like everybody else did. So, you know, it was moving into the property in Pennsylvania that got me thinking about the actual value of restoration on areas that have been wrecked. And it's so much of the country. And then when I saw how easily it worked, you know, all we did was put the plants back and we've got a thriving ecosystem right at home here. Well, I shouldn't say that. We took the invasives out and put the plants back. Not saying it wasn't a lot of work, but it really, really pays off. So that's the motivation that has kept me going, and just trying to tell everybody, you can do the same thing.
So there might be some people, I doubt it, but there might be some people on this call who have perhaps are just being introduced to you, have never read anything about you. Is there a particular book that they should start with to kind of ease their way into your work?
Well, Bringing Nature Home was the first book, but 10 years later, I wrote Nature's Best Hope, it's essentially the same theme, but updated with a lot. I learned a lot since I wrote Bringing Nature Home. So I would recommend Nature's Best Hope. It's more up to date. The urgency has increased. We've got, it's not data filled, but there's important studies in there that demonstrate if anybody's doubting that any of this is real, that would be what I suggest.
Okay.
Nature's Best Hope.
Nature's Best Hope. Okay. And we've got a lot of questions from people who really want to plant native plants, but they would like to know how you feel about planting native cultivars as opposed to straight native species.
Yeah, if you go to the nursery, that's often what you find is a cultivar. Yeah. So very common question. Are cultivars as ecologically valuable as a straight species? And the answer is it depends on what the cultivar change, what the genetic change has been to create the cultivar. So there's very little work on this, actually. We did a study, Annie White at Vermont did a study, and not much else has been done. Mount Cuba Center in Hockessin, Delaware is evaluating a number of cultivars, but it's brand new information. Our study looked at woody plants and their vegetation. What happens when you take a tall plant, make it short, when you have variegated leaves, when you take a green leaf and make it red or purple, enhance fall color, things like that. And the only trait that consistently reduced insect use was taking a green leaf and making it red or purple, because that floods the leaf with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. So I can say, avoid red leaf cultivars as much as you can. But the other traits didn't seem to impact insect use very much at all. The news wasn't as good for Annie White looking at flower traits. The bottom line is, and these are averages. There are some cultivars that make no difference. There's some cultivars that actually seem to increase rewards for pollinators. But on average, it's a reduction because you're messing with the traits that specialist pollinators depend on. When we change the flower color, not only do we change the color for us, but we've changed the UV spectrum, which is what bees actually use to find the plant. If we change the shape, if we make a double flower, you're taking the reproductive parts of the plant and turning it into a petal. So it's showier, but then you have no nectar and no pollen. So our efforts to enhance the aesthetic value of a flower often discourage the use by pollinators, particularly specialist pollinators. And cultivars are propagated clonally, which means there's zero genetic variability. So, our plants need all the genetic variability they can get to be able to handle the extreme climate variability that we're throwing at them now. It's just not wise to produce populations with no genetic variability. So for those reasons, I would always try to get the straight species if I could.
Thank you. So what is the best way for a private homeowner then to find accurate information for appropriate native planting for their local area? We get that question a lot. People want to do the right thing. They just don't know where to get these things to plant.
Well, for most of the US, we created a tool called Native Plant Finder at the National Wildlife Federation website. You go to Native Plant Finder and you put in your zip code, and the ranked list of the best woody and herbaceous plants for your county pop up. If you live in California, there's a better tool called CalScape, where every single plant is geo-referenced, every species. You can look at a map and see exactly where that species occurs, so that you can you see where you live, and you choose the species that are best for your particular area. We have a National Wildlife Federation has another resource called Keystone Plants by Ecoregion, and this includes information about the best plants for specialist pollinators in the ecoregion in which you live. So those resources are out there now, which gives you a whole lot more information than we had just a few years ago, when people really did scratch their heads and say, what are the best plants?
Thanks. Well, I realize there's variability where everybody lives who's on this call, but what for you and where you are, what are your top 3 favorite shrubs that you like to recommend for planting?
Favorite shrubs?
Mm-hmm.
We don't have that many native shrubs. They just didn't evolve. Certainly our viburnums are great. They're tops. Over 100 species of caterpillars supported on viburnums, and they flower and they make really valuable berries for the birds in the fall. Now I'm talking about native viburnums. You can get entire books on non-native viburnums, and none of them are going to provide much of anything. So stick with the natives. Viburnum dentatum, Viburnum nudum. Those are the big ones in the Virginia area. Now that there are small trees and things like witch hazel. Witch hazel is a valuable resource for a group of moths called winter moths. Witch hazels, of course, bloom essentially in the wintertime. They're not blooming yet. They're going to bloom, in early November, I guess, and then throughout November. There are moths that come out at night in those cold nights, and those are the things that pollinate those witch hazels. There's some specialists on witch hazel. It's not really highly ranked in terms of the number of plants that it supports, but there are shrubs that do really well in wet areas like clethra, sweet pepper bush, and buttonbush. Those two are great butterfly plants in the middle of the summer. They bloom, and middle of summer is usually it's a slow period for blooming plants. We have a lot in the spring and a lot in the fall, but not that much in the middle of summer. So those two are very good for butterflies. And they can grow in standing water. They don't need it, but they can tolerate that. Our willows are really important. They're right below oaks in terms of supporting caterpillars. So again, we've got a lot of species of willows, so many of them are shorter. You never want to have a pond with grass going right down to the pond. Line it with willows, and it becomes a really productive place. There are many others, but I'll stop.
I think everybody's probably writing down on the piece of paper furiously what you said about the viburnum. So we have a question from a younger person in our audience. What is the number one thing college students can do to help?
Okay, college student, you're transitioning into adulthood, but you still probably live at home. You haven't moved out yet. So in terms of actually getting some changes on the ground, you can convince your parents that this is something they've got to do. That would be the number one thing, I think. You can also, you're young and you're healthy and you're energetic. So, volunteer with your spare time for any of these. Land Conservancy is a great place to volunteer. Land conservancies have focused on purchasing land to protect it, but they don't have a big managerial staff to manage these landscapes. And of course, the invasive species problem is huge for land conservancies. So volunteer at your local land conservancy and they will love you.
Great. So do you have any advice for HOA boards that would like to encourage the use of native plants in their neighborhood? What are some strategies they can use?
Change their rules. It's the HOA boards that are discouraging it. So lighten up on the, all of the regulations you have. I understand that everybody wants to live in a high status neighborhood. That is great. And maintaining aesthetic standards is fine. This is why I say don't get rid of your lawn. I say reduce the area of lawn. Lawn is still a great cue for care, and having a strip of lawn along your driveway or around your various plantings shows that this is it's a planned landscape. You haven't moved out, and that strip of grass, your little area rugs of grass are going to be manicured and mowed, so you will fit into the standards of the HOA. But if the HOA had a list of plants that would be great to include in their neighborhood, people would do it. Most people are terrified of their HOA. They're afraid they're going to get fined and thrown out. So it would catch on pretty fast. And of course, having a demonstration garden somewhere in the neighborhood is a great way to go.
That's a good idea.
This is how you do it.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So there's been some movement for this in Virginia. We have a lady who's been trying to encourage Home Depot from selling invasive plants. Do you have any advice on how to help stop nurseries from selling invasive species, the big box stores?
Of course, Delaware just passed a rule saying you may not, it is now against the law. That would help. They are doing it because there's a market for it. So this is, I keep trying to kill the market by getting people to be educated consumers. Don't buy your burning bush. Yes, it should not be for sale. And in many places, they really are banned these days. Step one, if they're not going to ban it, is to insist that they have a label on it. This plant is highly invasive. It will destroy your local ecosystem. Enjoy.
Well, that'd be a good.
It's a big box store like that, unless we get to the CEO or something and give them good alternatives so they don't see a financial loss. People still want to buy plants. We just have to change the inventory. So if we can do that, it could happen, but it takes access to the big decision makers.
Got it. And before I move to Tim, who's going to read some questions that have been typed in the Q&A box, I've got another one. This person writes, I feel stymied by planning it all and trying to get it right. How do I begin? So for someone who just feels overwhelmed, they want to do the right thing, but are just overwhelmed, can you recommend some first steps?
Yeah, I would not think of it as a project that you have to finish next week. I would think of it as a lifetime hobby that you're going to pick at when you get a chance. And the easiest thing, particularly in Virginia, to do is plant a tree. A lot of people say, I'm going to stop mowing and make a meadow. That's probably the hardest thing to do. So planting a tree is easy. Planting a small tree is not only easy, it's probably free. The hardest thing is keeping the deer from eating it, but a little cage here and there, that's pretty easy. And that tree will grow. That tree will do a whole bunch. If you make that tree a productive tree, a black cherry or a hickory or one of the oaks, you can start counting the number of things that depend on that tree. If you put a bed under that tree, you've reduced the area of lawn that you have. Now you've got a target for when you're raking leaves. So that simple act, which might take you a half an hour on a Saturday, will definitely change the impact of your yard on local ecosystem. That's the easiest thing to do. And you might say, hey, that wasn't hard. Maybe I'll plant 2 trees. Maybe I'll get a diversity of trees. And this is how you get into it. But you only feel stymied when you try to take on more than you have time for. And of course, the other thing is most people don't garden at all. They hire somebody. I want that big empty niche of ecological landscapers to be filled with dozens of options. You can hire a reputable company instead of a mow, blow, and go company. They're gonna put the right plants in. They're going to maintain them, and you don't have to do a thing. You do have to pay them, but you're already paying your lawn guy. So it's switching services from something that's not helping to something that would help a lot.
Good answer. So Tim, are you here? Would you like to read out a couple of questions, a question or two from the audience that they've typed in today?
Well, I've been going through them, and it turns out that most of the questions that they ask, we've already covered in the series of questions that we've just been through.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm doing a great job here.
So you don't have any for us? Should we move on with some of the other ones on?
I guess.
Okay.
Are we making progress?
Yeah. So we did get a couple of questions about that. In your opinion, after all this work, are we making progress? Do you see any improvement?
Definitely. I've been talking about this at one level or another for just about 20 years now. And yes, I definitely see the needle moving. Groups all over the country are interested in. That's what I'm measuring. I cannot keep up with the talk requests or the Zoom requests or the podcast requests because so many people are interested in this. So that's the measure of success. Can I drive around and see all the neighborhoods changing? That's a little harder to see right now. But remember, the first thing we have to do is change attitudes, and then landscapes change fairly slowly. There was a big derecho in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, 2 years ago. Took down, I think, about 80% of the trees in the city. Well, they are replacing them in an ecologically responsible way. And they're doing it because this movement has directed. It's not just a bunch of Bradford pears again. Now we're going to focus on the trees that are really driving the ecosystem. So big changes like that are, they're really encouraging to me. It's the headlines are helping too. When people see we've lost 3 billion breeding birds, and I say, you can do something about that, they get excited about that because they don't want to see these biodiversity losses.
So, you mentioned climate change a few times in your presentation. And one of the questions we got is, with climate change, will we ever consider using native plants from regions south of us? In other words, will the natives from our area now become obsolete as our climate warms?
500 years from now, maybe, and totally obsolete, probably no. I mean, if you look at the range of many of our natives, so for example, beech trees, they go from Canada down to Florida. They've got huge ranges. So what you're talking about is genetic, the provenance of genotypes within that range that will adapt to local conditions. Those local conditions are changing now, but not so much in the way that people think. Everybody thinks global warming, it's slowly getting warmer as you move farther north. What's happening is we're getting more variable climate. We're getting hotter periods everywhere. We're getting colder periods in a lot of places. Remember 2 years ago, we had that polar vortex that went all the way down to Mexico. It even killed native plants down there. We have more floods. We have more stronger winds. All these things are happening. And yes, the average means it's getting slightly warmer, but it's extreme variability. And if we start moving southern plants far enough north and we get those cold snaps, it's just gonna kill them. I think the real solution is to encourage as much genetic variability in the populations we have. Keep our fingers crossed. We do want to do everything we can to limit the impact of climate change, but starting to move southern, if you're on the edge of a plant's distribution and you feel, well, can I plant it 100 miles north? Sure, go ahead. If it doesn't like it, it'll die. But you don't want to move plants out of the ranges of the things that use them, because then they're acting like a non-native plant. We did a study looking at 16 species of oaks and what was using the oaks to see, which oaks are the best. They're all really good, but the 2 oaks that did the poorest were willow oak and water oak, because we're right at the northern range of both of those. And the things that depend on those plants hadn't tracked that far north yet. So I say keep them within their native ranges. And
For the-
don't spend a lot of time on assisted migration. That's what it's called.
Okay. So putting you on the spot just a little bit, several people wanted to know when your next book will come out. They've read every single thing you've written and can't wait for the next thing. And
well, I'm on sabbatical in the spring. I am supposed to write another book. But even if I do, you know, I would submit it, and it takes them a year to edit it and another half a year to actually print it. So you're talking about a good 2 years from now, if I actually really get going here. I know I've got some ideas, and I do want to do that. So it's in the works. And no, I'm not going to tell you what it is.
Well, thank you so much, Doug. I just wanted to share my screen one last time so people could see that if they want to get more information about Homegrown National Park or the activities and your writings, to go to the website www.homegrownnationalpark.org. And if you'd like to learn more about invasive species or invasive species management, please visit us at www.blueridgeprism.org. Rod, Tim, and Jim, do you want to come back on? And I guess we are near the end of our webinar. We've been so happy to have you here with us. And I know that we didn't hit on every single question that everyone asked. And without you even asking, we're just going to go ahead and send you them. So you can take a look. Maybe it will spark some inspiration for your new book, or
Yeah, I'll write a book about them. Yeah.
right, something in the yard. But thank you everyone for coming. And Rod or Jim, do you have anything more you want to say?
Oh, well, I think this is all terrific. I really appreciate you being here. I did notice, by the way, numerous questions related to the subject of, is there some kind of DVD or version of the presentation that's recorded that they can take to their local group, be it landowners or garden clubs or whatnot, and play it for them? Is there some kind of DVD or thing that people could use since your schedule is so busy?
Well, you did record this, right?
Yes.
Yes, we did.
So
But
people
yeah,
can use that.
Yep, we're going to share it with everyone who registered, and there was a waiting list for this program, and we're also going to have it on the Blue Ridge Prism's YouTube channel.
Yeah, if you look at YouTube, there's a lot of people that posted different talks up there. You're welcome to use any of those. I don't have any DVDs.
You could probably distribute a million of them if you had them, though.
Yeah, maybe I should then. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Doug. And thank you everyone once again for joining us today for, part of your day. We really appreciate it. Thanks again for the Virginia Environmental Endowment for all of their help with us, and all of you who have donated to us in the past. And we hope that some of you consider donating to Blue Ridge Prism in the future. Have a great week.